Welcome to the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar.
Hello, this is Larry Goldberg, and I am co-chair of the subcommittee on the impact of artificial intelligence on people with disabilities and underserved communities. We are a subcommittee of the New York City Bar Association Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies. We're here today to have our first introductory podcast with a number of members of our subcommittee who are quite expert in the field of the impact of artificial intelligence, both positive and negative, or potentially, on people with disabilities and other underserved communities. I will start right now by asking each of the participants, to introduce themselves briefly, just what your name is, your title and affiliation, and then we'll get right into the substance of our talk. And today I'm going to start with Ariana Abulafia.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ariana Abulafia. I'm an attorney by training, and I currently lead the Disability Rights and Technology Policy Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where my work focuses on the ways that AI and algorithmic systems impact people with disabilities.
Thank you, Ariana. Cynthia Bennett.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Bennett. I'm a senior research scientist at Google Research, and I focus on ensuring that artificial intelligence represents people with disabilities respectfully and potential accessibility applications of artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Cynthia. Michael Burvell.
Hey everyone, my name is Michael Brevell and I'm currently the CEO and co-founder of Test Party. We're a digital accessibility platform that automates web accessibility compliance. So our mission is to rewrite source code at scale to hopefully make sure that everyone of all abilities can use websites, mobile apps, PDFs, images, and more. Excited to be here.
And Yuta Treviranus.
Hi, I'm Jutta Treviranus, and I'm the director of the Inclusive Design Research Center in Toronto, Canada at OCAD University. And I'm also the chair of a standards committee within the Accessible Standards Canada organization, which is creating standards for the Accessible Canada Act on accessible and equitable AI.
Thank you all. And I'm Larry Goldberg, and my background is in making media accessible, starting with public broadcasting in the United States, and closed captioning, audio description, and web technologies. Eventually became head of accessibility for Yahoo. Left there a couple of years ago, and now I'm consulting on various projects similar to this one, and with quite a few startups in the field. So with that, we're going to get going. You can tell we've got some great experts in the field of this particular issue, and there has been a tremendous amount of conversation over the past few years about the impact of artificial intelligence on people with disabilities and other underserved communities. We'll get started here today, but the subcommittee is going to be digging in over the next many months and figure out how we can help advance this field, as I say, both to promote the benefits and to avoid some of the hazards. Today, we're going to be mentioning such things as the European Accessibility Act going into effect this summer. It's going to have a major impact on various technologies, digital and otherwise, that will come up. So if you hear the letters EAA, that's what we're talking about. And of course, most of you probably know about the GDPR on privacy issues in the EU, and there's going to be a refresh around that. So those are two other issues that we'll need to pay attention to, as well as a number of activities going on here in the United States. And with that, I'm going to ask Ariana to give us some highlights of the new report that your organization, CDT, and the American Association of People with Disabilities released. It is called Building a Disability Inclusive AI Ecosystem, a cross-disability, cross-systems analysis of best practices. We will have a link to all of today's resources to go along with this podcast. So, Ariana, take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Larry. And this is Ariana. So, I think the first thing that I want to just say is that CDT and the American Association of People with Disabilities, which I'll be referring to as AAPD, we've had a partnership working at the intersection of disability rights and tech policy for several years now. In 2021, both CDT and AAPD put out a report that we entitled Centering People with Disabilities in Tech Policy. And the idea for that report was to lay out some of the ways that disabled people are impacted by technologies, including things like algorithmic systems, AI, and other emerging technologies. In a lot of ways, this new report can kind of be seen as a continuation of that initial report and also of our partnership together. And so the overarching idea behind this report was that there are all sorts of different players in an AI ecosystem. And so that can include, especially in this context, affected populations, so people with disabilities. That can include disability rights and disability justice advocates, members of civil society, so tech policy organizations. That can include people in industry who play a really significant role, and within industry, developers of these technologies, policymakers, regulators, and members of the private sector, including attorneys who may represent people if they've been harmed by technologies. And so all of those people play a role in the tech AI ecosystem. So the idea of this report was to provide some high-level background as to how people with disabilities are impacted by AI across all sorts of systems. And those systems include employment, education, public benefits, ICT, but focusing ICT meaning information and communications technology, but focusing mostly on assistive tech, healthcare, transportation, and the criminal legal system. And so to think about how people with disabilities are impacted by AI in all of those contexts, and then to provide recommendations for those various stakeholders, right? So state, local, and federal agencies, people with disabilities, and members of the private sector, including folks in industry, as to how they can make those systems more inclusive for disabled people. I would say that the framework that kind of undergirds a lot of this is very much a recognition that these tools can be quite helpful for people with disabilities in various contexts, but that there are ways to sort of maximize benefits and minimize or mitigate harms, and that each of these stakeholders can kind of play a different role in that. And so that's the overarching idea of the report. And one of the reasons why it's split up the way that it is and broken down by systems is that my work and the way that CDT does our disability rights work is that it is both cross-disability and cross-systems in nature, meaning that we don't focus just on one type of disability. We try to provide as much as possible with the understanding that disability, just like any other marginalized group, is not a monolith. But we try to provide solutions, policy solutions for that work for as many folks with as many different types of disabilities as possible. And my work is basically a horizontal that goes across all of our other verticals. So I think about how folks with disabilities are impacted in every aspect of our lives. And so this report kind of aims to reflect quite a bit of that.
Thanks, Ariana. Very helpful, and I encourage anyone who is watching or listening to the podcast and interested in the subject, take a look at that report. Very substantive, very important. After each of us has some time to talk about the work we're doing, we're going to have time to ask each other questions. So we'll come back to you and dig in a little deeper on each of these areas. But next, I'd like to ask Cynthia to tell us about her own background in the field and her recent research into the impacts of AI harms on people with disabilities. So, Cynthia.
Thank you. This is Cynthia speaking. So at Google Research, we have published a couple of papers where people with disabilities have evaluated generative AI. And so when I say generative AI, I'm referring to tools. You might have heard of some of them, maybe ChatGPT or Gemini or DALL-E or Midjourney. And these tools allow a user to enter a prompt, often in the form of text, but they're expanding, so even entering images or videos. So users enter information into the tool, and the tool generates a response. And this response could be text, it could be images, and that's also expanding into other realms, but I'm going to focus on text and images. And so when these tools give the user a response, they are representing different phenomena in that response. And we wanted to focus on how these tools represent people with disabilities in both text and images. And so the type of harm I'm specifically focusing on are called representational harms, or when people are written about or depicted in ways that could be harmful. So what we had in 2 separate research studies, again, people who have disabilities communing with us in focus groups, where they got a chance to enter text prompts into both AI text generators and AI image generators. And we asked them to enter prompts that were related to disability, as that was the purpose of our study. And then we asked them to evaluate the outputs. And so I'll go over just a few of the things that we found, and I'm sure the papers will be shared in the resources. So first of all, we tended to see that sometimes prompts did not generate images. So particularly in the case of images, some innocuous prompts, particularly related to mental health disabilities, an image would not be returned. And so there's work that we need to do to ensure that people can generate the content about disability that they want to generate. And so ensuring that content filtering is not overly censoring people with disabilities' interests in representing themselves. Now, when content was generated, we identified some harms. And so one of these harms is that physical disabilities, so people who tend to use wheelchairs or mobility aids, were quite widely represented, both in text stories about disability and also in images. And that's wonderful. We're so glad to see kind of some representation. However, it was homogeneous. And so our participants kind of repeatedly mentioned that disability had so many different manifestations that were not reflected. And this extended beyond kind of an overrepresentation of physical disabilities to also include often images of white men, and people wanted to see women with disabilities. They wanted to see Black people with disabilities, understanding that disability is an experience that affects all of humanity, not just particular demographics. So we had kind of a lot of other results that reflected different representational harms. So some additional ones included people with disabilities being written about as inspiring. So stories of people with disabilities climbing mountains or winning contests, which on their own are not problematic, but when they tend to be kind of, again, homogeneous, consistent representations, there lacks that variety, and people with disabilities want to be understood as everyday people. We also encountered that people with disabilities, or everyone in general, are using generative AI to seek information. And we found instances where people were seeking information about accessibility and they did not get an accurate response. And so there's opportunities to ensure that generative AI can provide accurate responses if someone has a question about how do I tie my shoe with one hand, or how do I know when a casserole is finished cooking if I can't see it? We know that generative AI tools being able to enter a prompt and get an instant response is a huge accessibility win. It removes the burden of tiring searching several websites. And so for this information to be representative, high quality, and accurate is extremely important. We have some open questions in our research, such as some people have invisible disabilities, meaning that if you're talking to them, you might not know. And so how do we represent people with invisible disabilities in a context like images, where we are relying on, certain visual markers? So there's open questions. And for example, how much representation of different disability types? Should it reflect population statistics, or should we use an equity model where certain low incidence disabilities are represented more just so that they get more visibility? And so there's a lot of complex and open questions that I'm really excited for you all to explore in your own work.
The New York City Bar Association is a dynamic community of over 23,000 legal practitioners. Members shape the future of the legal profession, serve the public, and gain an edge in their careers. To learn more about becoming a member of the City Bar or to join today, visit nycbar.org/join. Save 20% on semi-annual dues when you join. Call Customer Relations at 212-382-6663 and use code POD24.
Thank you, Cynthia. That was a great dive into some of the harms, and the reports that you're referencing will be available also as part of this podcast. So we'll include links to those as well. You did raise some of the benefits of AI for the communities we're talking about. And I think Michael and your new company has been exploring some of the benefits as well, though you're clearly very well aware of potential harms. So why don't you tell us a bit about Test Party and how you're deploying AI in ways that benefit people with disabilities?
Yeah, one of the things that Cynthia mentioned that I really loved was how a lot of the outputs of AI systems or generative AI systems don't represent people with disabilities. And that's primarily because the inputs, the training data, don't include people with disabilities. So one thing that we're thinking through at Test Party is given that a lot of the inputs don't have, outputs that are accessible or that are disability aware, how do we change the inputs or how do we adjust the inputs to create better outputs? We focus specifically on digital accessibility. And what that looks like for us is thinking through, how do we make websites more accessible? The super easy answer would be, just take existing website code, put it into an LLM and hit run or say, make this accessible. And you would hope that the output would be accessible. Unfortunately, today, 97% of the million most visited websites are not accessible. So if I were to take my existing code base and put it into an LLM or generative AI system like what Cynthia described, it would have inaccessible outputs. So our mission as a company is to think through two things. Either one, how do we adjust the inputs and the outputs to be more accessible? Or two, how do we transform inputs in specific ways using AI or just using more deterministic models to have accessible outputs? For example, can we scan a whole code base, figure out all the images and videos, and automatically create captions, alternative text for images, and audio description? So we're looking at standards called like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which almost every regulation, whether it's in America or Canada or across Europe, rolls up to when trying to define what accessible digital products are. And our thought, is there a way that we can automate part of that WCAG compliance for those accessibility guidelines? So we started the company about a year and a half ago. It's been a really fantastic journey. My background before this was working a lot in the nonprofit space. I spent some time consulting at Google. I was on the investment team at Microsoft at the same time that we were making investments in AI startups like OpenAI. So I was able to see the industry grow and change. And it's been kind of just phenomenal to be working now at the intersection of technology and accessibility, especially with this AI revolution. It's such a new technology. No one really knows what it can do. And I think one of my biggest kind of realizations in the last few months has been that it's an emergent technology. Even when the teams at OpenAI are releasing new models, or even Llama or DeepSeek or whatever it may be, no one truly knows what the models can do. There is no user guide for how to use a ChatGPT or a DeepSeek. It's emergent behavior. By participating with the technology and using the technology, you discover more of how it can be adapted to your specific use case, whether in legal or accessibility or beyond. So we're primarily playing with AI in the space of accessibility and trying to be really aware of the harms and the impacts and also the benefits.
Thank you, Michael. And you've certainly gotten yourself up to speed very quickly in the community of people who care about this. And Utah has been there for a while now and is looked up to by many people in the field. You, in your work, Utah, have raised pretty important issues regarding AI and people with disabilities. From your positions at Ontario College of Art and Design, in the Canadian government, and venues all over the world, I believe you've been traveling to many countries over the past few weeks. So In all that you've been looking at and dealing with, takeaways do you think the members of the New York City Bar should consider as they increase awareness and develop recommendations for the legal community?
Thank you, Larry. And I think one thing to note is that disability and AI is extremely challenging from an evidentiary perspective. People with disabilities experience the extreme harms of AI, but this tends to be very difficult to prove. One thing to note about disability is there is a difference between disability and every other discriminated group. Disability is also at the margins of every other marginalized group. And to understand this, you need to understand a little bit about disability and data. One of the things that I've been doing is collecting data about what people need to thrive and participate fully in society. And I've been doing this for over 40 years. And so I have this large data set, and the only way that I can plot the data set is in what's called a high-dimensional multivariate scatter plot. And this looks like a starburst. I call it the human starburst. It's very similar to what Pareto noticed when he created the 80-20 rule. And basically what happens with this data set is that 80% of the needs are clustered in the middle 20% of the space. And this is where people who are average or typical are clustered, or the needs that are average or typical are clustered. And the rest of the data points are scattered in the remaining 80% of the periphery. And the needs at the periphery, where most needs related to disability exist, are far apart, meaning they're very different from each other. People with disabilities and their requirements are very different from each other. The needs in the middle, which is where the average sits, are very similar to each other. And at its most basic, AI is a statistical reasoning machine. It's a statistical reasoning machine that is trying to find the typical, the average within the data set that it has available. And so what we've discovered is that what AI is doing is it is intended, it is fundamentally designed to discriminate against those outliers, those peripheral needs, those peripheral individuals. So when AI is used by somebody with a disability to become normative, so AI is wonderful at doing things like recognizing things in your environment, translating between languages, and all of those are based upon its ability to find the average, the predictable, the statistically most likely. But unfortunately, when AI is making decisions about people or about characteristics of people or how they do their job or how they learn or how they do any of these things, it is discriminating against anyone that deviates from that middle. And this is a pattern that was there before AI. It's existed in the way we do research, basing our assumptions about what is true on what is true for the average. In our decision making, basing our decisions on majority rules, which often means that the critical needs of the minority are overweighed by the trivial needs of the majority. So this is a pattern that has existed, but because AI can do it so much more efficiently and accurately, it is basically amplifying, automating, and accelerating that pattern. And this has a very systemic, very pervasive effect on anyone that is not like the average. It can be seen as a digital eugenics machine. It is basically eliminating anything that is divergent, anything that is outlying. And so in employment, it's creating monocultures. In education, it is discriminating towards the past success patterns. So it's repeating our success patterns of the past. And this, of course, means that because people with disabilities have been discriminated against in the past, they will be discriminated against even more in the future. And my current major concern is that even the efforts that are attempting to protect people from the harms of AI are replicating that same pattern. So the harms that are occurring for people with disabilities are seen as anecdotal, they're seen as insignificant, because every one of those harms is different from each other. So there is no statistical power. You cannot show a pattern. Everybody is harmed in a different way because their needs are different and they differ from the average in a different way. And as AI gets better and more accurate, better quality, as it's saying, more efficient, it is getting more efficient and accurate and better at that discrimination. And so this is a huge legal challenge. And it's more than the fact that people with disabilities are not represented in the data. Even if it were possible to have full proportional representation in the data, even if we could eliminate all of those stigmas that come from that polluted data pool, because it is a polluted data pool with respect to people with disabilities, even if we could remove the stigmatized proxies or the things that stand in for data, or eliminate the human discrimination from the AI decision algorithms, the AI, given that it is a statistical reasoning machine, at the moment, looking for the popular, the monetarily most profitable, is still going to discriminate against the outliers and against the margins. And people with disabilities are those outliers and margins. And so what we need to do is to do more than work with the data. We need to look at how can we invert the algorithms. And there are early experiments in this where what happens is, say, in employment, you look for perspectives that are currently missing rather than finding people that match the success pattern of the past. We need to tune things so that they are going to work for people who are small minorities and outliers. One of the other, you were mentioning GDPR. One of the things that's quite significant about privacy is that the current privacy protections that are legislated in other countries, obviously not federally in the US, are ineffective for people with disabilities. First off, most people with disabilities have already bartered their privacy for essential services. Nobody reads that legalese that before they accept the terms of service, especially it's so critical that you need the service that is being offered. Then the next thing is that if you are highly unique, you will be re-identified. If you have any aggregate data, you can figure out who within your neighborhood ordered that colostomy bag, say, and then you know that's the person with a disability. The other thing is there's been advice by people that wish to protect people with disabilities to say, let's remove the data or excise the data that identifies you as having a disability, say in an employment application or in an academic application. But what that does is it removes the useful information that would allow the AI to serve you. And so we're doing the opposite of what Cindy's doing, which is adding that essential information about disability so the AI works better for you. So the privacy protections do not work. We need to go beyond privacy protections. We need to have measures that when there is abuse or misuse, there is some consequence, because at the moment we have very little to help people recover from fraud, from data abuse, and people with disabilities are the most vulnerable to data abuse and misuse. So one of the things that we're doing is we've created this regulatory system or a regulatory standard that is intended to sit on top of the existing protections that exist within the EU, within Canada, within other countries and states and cities, to specifically look at what are the risks that people with disabilities experience. And this includes the statistical discrimination, which is missed in most other standards and regulations. And then secondly, the cumulative harm, because almost every other regulation is based upon impact assessments and risk assessments. And of course, those mean that if they are statistically insignificant, then they're deemed not to be high impact, they're deemed not to be high risk. And so there's this cumulative harm that exists if everything is ruling against you. Every single decision is one that either does not understand you or eliminates you. And the other area we're looking at is how do we bolster those privacy protections such that we go beyond privacy towards addressing data abuse and misuse.
Thank you for that. Incredibly helpful and really good marching orders for the work that we think the Presidential Task Force wants to take on. Very helpful. Now, there's another member of our subcommittee who couldn't make it today. This is Dr. Ariel Silverman, who's the Director of Research at the American Foundation of the Blind. And she's done some excellent work too. We're providing links to her studies. And one is called Empowering or Excluding: New Research and Principles for Inclusive AI. As well as doing a Delphi study, she reached out to experts for their insights on inclusive artificial intelligence for people with disabilities. So Ariel will be joining us in future gatherings and in the work of this subcommittee. So now I'd like to open it up to each other to ask each other questions, probe deeper, anything that struck you from any of our presentations that you want to raise.
I did want to respond to Yuta because I think Yuta raised a lot of really interesting considerations. And one was this idea of AGI on the bell curve and how it optimizes for the middle of the bell curve. And one thing I like to think about quite frequently is that almost all of our best innovations happened on the edges of the bell curve. For instance, if you were to ask, I think there's a Henry Ford quote, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? And essentially, if you query AI, it's giving us the faster horses answer, which sometimes is the right answer. But oftentimes that innovation, if you're looking for innovation in a specific field, it happens at the edges of the bell curve. There have been studies that have come out around at work, where does artificial intelligence actually boost productivity? And they find that it boosts productivity for the worst performers, but for the best performers, the productivity is boosted nowhere as near. Meaning the more expert you are, the more outlier you are, the less helpful this general tool is. And there's a lot of talk around AGI, which stands for Artificial General Intelligence. And I think what Yuta is bringing up here, and perhaps one of the solutions is, what does artificial specific intelligence look like versus artificial general intelligence? And if people talk about fine-tuning models and getting very specific data sets, and again, it's an emergent technology. No one, I think, truly knows what the effects will be. But there is this argument that maybe the data set you have and the data mode that you have and the data that you generate, which can create specialized models for individuals, might be the solution here versus these generalized models that are supposed to solve general problems.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, not only is innovation comes from the edge, from people that are not satisfied with the current status quo. It doesn't come from the complacent middle. So almost everything that is innovative and that actually meaningfully moves us forward comes from individuals that are challenged by the current state. And that's also where we find the signals of cracks to come, right? It's the weak signals of crises, because if you're living at that edge, you are the first to feel what might be a problem for that complacent middle. And if we design in such a way that it works for that outer distribution, then we're designing in a way that prepares us as a society for the next crisis to come. It means greater flexibility, greater adaptability, and it gives us more choices. And unfortunately, I think there's a huge issue in the way we're using AI for society as a whole. We're making ourselves less risk prepared by reducing our choices, by becoming more of a monoculture, which is what AI is doing. We're not going to be able to react appropriately or have the choices that we need to react to the next crisis. I think one of the other points that comes from that sort of statistical distribution is, unfortunately, while AI offers extreme opportunities for people with disabilities, they work the worst for people that need it the most. So what's happening is unfortunately, employers are saying, well, we have AI to accommodate these issues. But that AI works differentially. It will work for people that are closest to the norm, and it will work the worst for people that are furthest from the norm. And so it's adding this additional disparity. There's disparity in the treatment of disparity, and we're harming the people that are needing those measures, those anti-discrimination measures the most.
This is Cynthia. I'm curious if we have time for one more question. I'd love to
Yes.
hear from Ariana. So the New York City Bar, given the context, we've seen over the past decades kind of more in terms of legal work in employment and education sectors. And so I'm curious, given that Ariana's reports have kind of dived into these specific kind of sectors of life, if you have just any comments on the new report and any sort of insights regarding employment and education, as we're seeing there's lots of potential changes that are happening right now in those areas.
Sure, this is Ariana. I'm happy to answer that. And before I do, I actually also want to comment a little bit on what Yuta just said too. I think it's really important to just dig in there just very briefly that, algorithms, and Michael, you had mentioned this too, right? Algorithms generally are trained on pattern recognition. And so a lot of the ways, and I am a person with a disability and some rare ones at that. And I think that a lot of people with disabilities sort of, if you're thinking about why there may be an inherent incompatibility, it's because a lot of folks with disabilities may exist kind of outside of what an algorithm is trained to recognize as a pattern. So that could be someone who has, let's say, an atypical eye contact or atypical vocal cadence or anything like that, right? And when you have these sorts of tools that are built to recognize patterns, and then you have people who inherently exist in a spectrum of completely different ways, there is sort of like an inherent incompatibility there. And I sometimes say that algorithms and AI systems can be a force multiplier. And what I mean by that is that people with disabilities have faced stigma and discrimination and risk of harm through their contacts in a lot of systems for a very long time. And that includes healthcare, that includes employment, that includes education. These algorithms and AI systems, when they're incorporated into these systems, they have the ability to ameliorate some of these concerns, but they oftentimes wind up multiplying the concerns instead. I use this term tech-facilitated disability discrimination. And what I typically mean by that is that, discrimination, again, whether it's in housing or in healthcare or in education or in employment, that's not new for people with disabilities. The technology is a new-ish lever by which this discrimination is occurring, but the discriminatory outcomes aren't new, right? And because of that, we can also think about some of the basic tenets of the disability rights and disability justice movements when we're thinking about the best ways to address this. And so when I think about, and Judith has done so much incredible work on this, but when I think about, better design of algorithmic systems, my mind goes back to inclusive design. And what would it look like to inclusively design an algorithmic system? And Cynthia's work, on AI tools too similarly, right? Like, what would it look like to design an AI tool inclusively from the start that was, useful for and worked for people with disabilities? And we can go back to these, rallying cries of nothing about us without us. And, what that means is that, disabled people are being impacted by employment, by education, by healthcare, by all the decisions that are made within those systems. And so we need to be at those tables when those decisions are made, including the decisions regarding the integration of these sorts of tools, right? The AI tools, the algorithmic tools, et cetera. Both the employment and the education sections of this report outline sort of some basic things that we're seeing, right? In the employment section, there's a bit that talks about hiring tools, also known as automated employment decision systems, and how they impact people with disabilities, as well as on-the-job sort of surveillance tools. So that can include things like keystroke monitors and how those impact people with disabilities at work. My work generally is U.S. based. I'm a U.S. licensed attorney, so some of the arguments in the report focus on and reference to U.S. based disability laws. So that includes things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which can apply in the employment context as well as other contexts. It's a fairly broad anti-discrimination law. And we also reference things like the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act in the education section, that's also known as the I. And we also reference the Rehabilitation Act, particularly Section 504, which is sometimes just referred to as Section 504. When we think about the ways in which, those latter two particularly, we're thinking about the ways in which some education technologies can impact youth with disabilities, and that includes things like student activity monitoring software. So there are definitely ways to couch this advocacy in, at least, again, from my area of knowledge, US-based disability law. And there are also, I'm sure, and many of my colleagues on this podcast know much more about ways to couch it in international laws and statutes as well.
Thank you, Ariana. Very helpful. Clearly, our subcommittee's got its work cut out for us. We'll be figuring out what our priorities are over the coming weeks and months. But you've raised a lot of the essential ones. I have always been taken with Yuta's description of the human starburst and how that and the bell curve work together and against each other. I think we're going to need human starburst T-shirts for our subcommittee. It'll be a perfect look and feel. Yuta, one presentation I attended that you mentioned the notion that people with disabilities are not just affected by technologies like AI, but often have it built into their bodies. That's how essential it is. And boy, did that strike me. Why don't you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, there's a saying that for most people, technology makes things convenient. For people with disabilities, it makes things possible. And that is the case. I mean, as people with disabilities, we depend upon it to speak, to read, to write, to breathe. And you've probably seen the advertising for brain-computer interfaces and this notion that AI and technology will make things possible in terms of individuals who are locked in or are non-speaking. Unfortunately, we're frequently used as the poster children of a way of justifying the harms because, of course, look at these amazing opportunities, and why would you want to deny somebody the ability to be able to recognize something when they can't see, recognize something when they can't hear, etc. But it also means that there's this massive responsibility. Vulnerability, it is so much more of an intimate relationship with the technology that it also makes us so much more vulnerable to any of the harms. And frequently the pattern when these technologies are used in the disability sector is that once the technology is proven, the specific application for individuals with disabilities is abandoned because there aren't the economies of scale. So those same statistical issues abound. So there are many innovations that were initiated for people with disabilities, but once they caught on and became adopted, then the economies of scale to specifically serve people with disabilities dropped away. And so there were no longer ways in which they were supported. The issue is that for a vendor to create something that works well with people with disabilities, you are having to specialize more and create adaptable systems. But our systems are created as solutions. And when we are choosing or prioritizing solutions, it's based upon majority rules. And so again, when we choose a winner in terms of the solution, we scale that and we market it. But where there are winners, there are losers. And it's usually the outliers, the small minorities, that are the losers.
Yeah. I just want to have one reaction to something Ariana said, and then I'll see if anyone else has some final comments. I have taken lately to talking simply about nothing without us, because everything is about us. If you have a disability, there's nothing that doesn't touch your life one way or another. So simply nothing without us. Save some characters too. So in wrapping up, anyone else have any final comments before we thank you and say goodbye?
I would love to hear from Cynthia, particularly because of a lot of the research that she's been doing at Google around some of these topics that we chatted about today.
This is Cynthia. Just in following up, is there something specific you wanted me to expand on, or?
I think I'm just curious about your reactions to this, right? A lot of the generative AI systems can only be created by companies that have a lot of extra resources. And, Google, Anthropic, governments that are funding some of this research, even Microsoft. So yeah, just curious your take, given I think your unique position within the industry.
Yeah, thanks for your question. So, in hearing kind of a lot, building on a lot of what Yuta and others have said, again, thinking about inclusive design and some areas for future research that I'm seeing that are necessary is not only inclusive design, but inclusive evaluation. So, for example, the evaluations we did with people with disabilities, unfortunately, they're quite rare. So often evaluating technology or artificial intelligence, the approach is, can we automate evaluations? Can we, send out surveys to large numbers of people? And I think that could be possible in the future. But right now, we don't actually know how to evaluate AI systems in ways that honor the needs of people with disabilities. And so I would add that, yes, design with people with disabilities from the very beginning is essential and also is an essential part of developing these evaluations. I will provide one specific example of artificial specific intelligence, which I think Michael's brilliant for coming up with. So at Google, we have a product called Project Relate, where people who have non-standard speech can actually train their own speech recognizer. And so this is an example where, automatic speech recognition, which is built to, recognize, quote, average speech, often that follows on lines of privilege or discrimination. We've heard that often it does not correctly understand African American vernacular English and also non-standard speech. And so this is, there's often tensions in these standard systems should work for everyone. And also it can be really helpful and empowering to allow users to customize their own systems. And that Project Relate, that people with non-standard speech can train their own speech recognizer, is an example of a technology like that where end users have given fairly positive feedback. That's a context where a specific tool that they get to customize themselves works really well for them.
And if I can just add one thing, that one of the things we address within the Canadian standard is this notion of nothing without us, because of course that's the clarion call of our disability sector in Canada. And what that means is that frequently people with disabilities are viewed as simply consumers of AI. And within the standard, we're looking at how can people with disabilities be viewed as producers of AI as well. So how do we increase the participation by making those evaluation tools, the development tools, all of the parts within the ecosystem that Ariana talked about accessible? And that is a huge lift, because at the moment, as Cindy probably can attest to, many of them are not accessible at all.
So is artificial specific intelligence something you're going to copyright, Michael? Because in many ways, this is what we're talking about, like the speech recognition for non-standard speech and many others. The general doesn't necessarily help, and the specific is going to really have an effect. Yeah. Any other last words today? And
On device and hybrid AI, where you salvage the best of the general intelligence, but add to it the specific. So going back to actually what Cindy was talking about earlier, the recognition that is specific to the individual. My first foray into AI way back in the 80s was actually looking at recognition of dysarthric speech. But at that time, the data set was built up from the ground by individuals with dysarthric speech. So can we create something that is a hybrid that salvages the strengths of the Gen AI with the earlier forms of AI.
Well, I hope the work that we're going to be doing will help address a lot of these issues. I know the task force chairs, Jerome and Lorraine, are action-oriented, and we all are. We would like to have some tangible results from the work we're doing. So I want to thank the Presidential Task Force and all of you, Yuta, Ariana, Michael, and Cynthia. We're going to roll up our sleeves. We'll be back at you. Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Find more City Bar podcasts on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeart, or at our website at www.nycbar.org/podcasts. Be sure to check out This Lawyer's Life, a professional development podcast where we talk with lawyers about seizing opportunities, learning lessons the hard way, and about what makes them tick. And don't miss Building Belonging, a podcast that embraces authentic conversations about DEIB solutions by amplifying the most marginalized voices in the legal industry and exploring spaces others dare not. This podcast was produced and edited by Eli Cohen.